She wore the same grey uniform every day, moved through marble hallways like a ghost, and cleaned around conversations as if she didn't exist. But when three girls cornered a sobbing child in the library, Maria Santos stepped forward with words that would shatter a billionaire's world. What she whispered wasn't a threat. It wasn't even loud. But it was the kind of truth that changes everything. This is a story about invisible courage, about the power we don't see coming, and about how sometimes the people we overlook are exactly the ones we need most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Hamilton Academy was the kind of school where tuition cost more than most people's annual salary, where manicured lawns stretched endlessly between buildings of imported stone, and where every classroom was equipped with technology that most universities could only dream of. Here, the children of tech moguls and oil barons learned alongside the offspring of entertainment royalty and pharmaceutical heiresses. It was a place designed to cultivate excellence, where even the janitor's closets were more elegant than most people's living rooms. Maria Santos had been cleaning these hallways for 3 years, and in all that time she had perfected the art of being invisible. She arrived each morning at 5:30, long before the first student stepped through the heavy oak doors. By the time the day began in earnest, she had already moved through half the building like a shadow, leaving everything spotless in her wake. She knew which hallways echoed and which ones absorbed sound. She knew where the morning light hit the windows at exactly the right angle to create rainbows on the wall. She knew the rhythm of every classroom, the habits of every teacher, and the unspoken rules of staying out of sight. The students barely registered her presence. To them, she was simply part of the environment, as natural and unremarkable as the expensive artwork that lined the corridors. They would walk past her without a glance, step around her cart without acknowledgment, and continue their conversations as if she were nothing more than furniture. Maria had learned to time her movements perfectly, appearing in doorways only after classes had begun, finishing her work in bathrooms during lunch periods when they were empty, and always making sure she was gone before dismissal. This invisibility wasn't accidental. It was a skill she had cultivated through necessity, born from too many years of being seen only when something needed fixing, when someone needed blaming, or when there was work to be done that no one else wanted to touch. She had learned that the less space she took up, the safer she became. The quieter her footsteps, the fewer questions people asked. The faster she worked, the sooner she could retreat to the sanctuary of storage rooms and supply closets where no one bothered to look. But being invisible had its advantages. It meant she saw things that others missed. She noticed when teachers were struggling with difficult students, when children were being left out of group activities, and when the delicate social hierarchies of adolescence were causing real pain. She observed the way certain students carried themselves with the weight of expectations too heavy for their small shoulders. She witnessed moments of kindness that went unacknowledged, and cruelties that went unpunished because they happened in the spaces between adult supervision. The Hamilton Academy prided itself on character development and ethical leadership, but like any institution filled with privilege and pressure, it had its dark corners. There were students who learned early that money could solve most problems, and that influence could make inconvenient truths disappear. There were children who had never heard the word no delivered with genuine authority, and others who had never experienced consequences that couldn't be bought or negotiated away. In this environment, power dynamics played out in miniature, rehearsals for the adult world these children would inherit. Maria had seen it all from her position on the periphery. She had watched promising students crumble under parental expectations, witnessed acts of generosity that never made it into the school newsletter, and observed the subtle ways that wealth created both opportunities and isolation. But she had also learned not to intervene. Her job was to clean, not to judge. Her role was to maintain, not to disrupt. She was there to keep the environment pristine, not to involve herself in the messy complexity of human relationships. This philosophy had served her well for 3 years. She had managed to keep her job, pay her rent, and send small amounts of money back to her mother in Guatemala. She had avoided the kind of workplace drama that could lead to whispered complaints and sudden terminations. She had been the perfect employee, efficient, quiet, and completely forgettable. But on a Tuesday morning in October, as autumn painted the academy's maple trees in shades of amber and gold, Maria's carefully constructed invisibility was about to be shattered. She was in the library that morning, dusting the mahogany shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, when she heard voices coming from behind the rare books section. The Hamilton Academy Library was a marvel of architecture and scholarship, with reading nooks tucked into alcoves, study tables crafted from reclaimed oak, and windows that filtered the morning light into soft, warm beams. It was usually a place of quiet concentration, where even whispers seemed to carry more weight than usual. But the voices she heard weren't whispers. They were sharp, deliberate, and carried the particular cruelty that only children seem capable of perfecting. Maybe if you weren't so weird, people would actually want to sit with you at lunch. The voice belonged to Madison Whitmore, daughter of a pharmaceutical executive and undisputed queen of the 7th grade social hierarchy. Madison had inherited her mother's sharp cheekbones and her father's ruthless business instincts, creating a combination that made her both beautiful and dangerous in the way that only 13-year-old girls could be. "I'm not weird," came a smaller voice, shaky with the effort of holding back tears. "I just like different things." Maria paused in her dusting, the cloth stilling in her hand. She recognized the second voice immediately. It belonged to Sophie Hamilton, and the irony of the last name was not lost on anyone who knew the girl's story. Sophie was indeed a Hamilton, but not in the way that mattered at this school. Her grandfather had founded the academy 70 years ago with dreams of creating an institution that would shape leaders and cultivate character. But by the time Sophie was old enough to attend, the family fortune had dwindled, and she was only able to remain at the school through a scholarship fund that her grandfather had established before his death. Sophie Hamilton was brilliant in the way that made adults uncomfortable and children suspicious. She read philosophy books during recess, wrote poetry in margins of her math homework, and asked questions that teachers weren't always prepared to answer. She was the kind of child who could discuss the emotional complexity of classical literature with the same ease that her classmates discussed the latest fashion trends or social media drama. But in an environment where conformity was often valued above curiosity, her intelligence had become a liability. "Different is just another word for wrong," Madison continued, her voice dripping with the casual cruelty that came naturally to those who had never experienced powerlessness. "And honestly, Sophie, the way you dress, the things you say, the books you read, it's all just attention-seeking. Nobody actually cares about your weird theories or your depressing poems." Maria found herself frozen between the philosophy and history sections, her cart positioned so that she could hear everything but remain unseen. Every instinct told her to move away, to retreat to another part of the library where she could continue her work without becoming involved in student conflicts. This was exactly the kind of situation she had spent 3 years learning to avoid. "They're not depressing," Sophie said, and Maria could hear the girl struggling to keep her voice steady. "They're just honest about how complicated feelings can be." "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about," Madison replied, and Maria could picture the eye roll that undoubtedly accompanied the words. "Normal people don't think feelings are complicated. Normal people just feel happy or sad or angry. They don't write entire essays about the nuanced emotional landscape of adolescent friendship or whatever pretentious garbage you handed in for English last week." There was movement behind the shelves, the sound of books being shifted, and Maria realized that Madison wasn't alone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She could make out at least two other sets of footsteps, which meant Sophie was outnumbered. The dynamics of middle school social warfare were becoming clear, and Maria felt her chest tighten with a familiar anxiety. "I wasn't trying to be pretentious," Sophie said, her voice getting smaller. "I was just trying to be honest about what I observed." "What you observed?" This was a new voice, belonging to Jessica Park, daughter of a tech entrepreneur and Madison's closest ally in the complex social ecosystem of 7th grade. "You mean what you made up to sound smarter than everyone else?" Maria had seen this pattern before, though never from such close proximity. The Hamilton Academy had strict policies against bullying, but enforcement was complicated when the aggressors were students whose families donated generously to the school's endowment. There were consequences, but they were often mild and temporary, more focused on rehabilitation than punishment. The administration preferred to handle conflicts through mediation and character development exercises rather than suspension or expulsion. But those policies relied on adults being present to witness and intervene. They assumed that problematic behavior would occur in spaces where teachers could observe and address it immediately. What they didn't account for were moments like this, tucked away in the quiet corners of the library during the brief period between first bell and the start of formal classes. "I don't try to sound smarter than everyone else," Sophie said, and now Maria could definitely hear tears in her voice. "I just think about things differently." "Right, because you're so special and unique," came a third voice that Maria didn't immediately recognize. "That's why you sit alone at lunch reading those weird books instead of trying to make friends like a normal person." The unfairness of the accusation made Maria's jaw clench involuntarily. She had observed Sophie during lunch periods, had seen the girl's attempts to join conversations only to be met with eye rolls and dismissive comments. She had watched Sophie eventually retreat to the library or empty classrooms, not out of antisocial preference, but out of self-preservation. The girl hadn't chosen isolation. It had been imposed on her by peers who seemed threatened by her intelligence and individuality. "Maybe I would make friends if people weren't so mean all the time," Sophie said, and her voice was getting stronger, touched with the kind of anger that comes from months of accumulated frustration. "Maybe I would try harder to fit in, if fitting in didn't mean pretending to be stupid or shallow, or only caring about things that don't matter." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Maria realized she was holding her breath, waiting to see how Madison would respond to being challenged so directly. In her experience, bullies didn't react well to their victims fighting back, especially when those victims made valid points that cut close to uncomfortable truths. "Wow," Madison said finally, her voice dripping with mock surprise. "So now we're the problem? We're mean and shallow because we don't want to spend our lunch break discussing the deeper meaning of your depressing poetry." "That's not what I said," Sophie replied, but her voice was wavering again. "That's exactly what you said," Jessica jumped in. "You basically just called all of us stupid for not being as intellectual as you think you are." Maria could feel the conversation spiraling into territory that would leave lasting damage. She had witnessed enough of these interactions to know that they rarely ended well for the person who found themselves outnumbered. The psychological dynamics were predictable. The group would continue to escalate until Sophie either broke down completely or said something that could be twisted into justification for further cruelty. She should leave. She should push her cart to the other side of the library and focus on her work. She should maintain the careful invisibility that had protected her for 3 years and allow this situation to resolve itself without her interference. Getting involved in student conflicts was outside her job description, potentially dangerous for her employment status, and unlikely to actually help anyone involved. But as she stood there, listening to Sophie's voice grow smaller with each exchange, Maria found herself remembering another girl who had stood alone against a group of peers, determined to make her suffer for being different. She remembered the feeling of walls closing in, The desperate search for adults who cared enough to intervene, and the crushing realization that sometimes being right didn't matter if you didn't have the power to defend yourself. "You know what your problem is, Sophie," Madison was saying, her voice taking on the particular tone that children use when they've decided to go for the kill. "You think being smart makes you better than everyone else, but really it just makes you pathetic. Smart people know how to make friends. Smart people know how to fit in. Smart people don't spend their whole lives being miserable and alone because they're too good for everyone around them." The cruelty of the statement was breathtaking in its precision. Madison had identified Sophie's greatest vulnerability, her loneliness, and used it as a weapon while simultaneously blaming the victim for her own isolation. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced serious consequences for causing emotional harm. Maria heard Sophie's sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone who had just been struck by a truth too painful to deflect. In that moment, she made a decision that would change the trajectory of her carefully ordered life. She stepped around the corner. The three girls turned toward her with expressions of surprise and mild annoyance, the way children look when adults interrupt their games. Sophie was backed against the rare books section, tears streaming down her face, her school blazer wrinkled and her usually neat ponytail askew. Madison, Jessica, and the third girl, whom Maria now recognized as Chloe Brennan, daughter of a real estate mogul, stood in a loose semicircle, their body language radiating the confidence of those who had never expected to be challenged. "Is there a problem here?" Maria asked quietly, her voice carrying the slight accent that marked her as different in this world of carefully modulated American English. Madison's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Excuse me?" "I asked if there was a problem," Maria repeated, taking another step forward. She was aware that her presence was unusual. The cleaning staff were not supposed to involve themselves in student conflicts. But something about Sophie's tear-streaked face had awakened a protective instinct she had thought long buried. "Not really," Jessica said with a dismissive shrug. "We were just talking to Sophie about some stuff." "It looked like more than talking," Maria said, her gaze moving between the three girls. She had learned to read body language through years of navigating situations where words couldn't be trusted, and what she saw here was unmistakably predatory. "We weren't doing anything wrong," Chloe added, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. Students at Hamilton Academy were accustomed to being the most important people in any room, but they also understood hierarchies of authority, even when those hierarchies were unclear. Maria looked directly at Sophie, taking in the girl's tear-stained cheeks and defensive posture. "Are you okay, miss?" Sophie stared at her with wide eyes, clearly surprised that any adult had noticed her distress, much less cared enough to ask about it. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak, caught between relief that someone had intervened and uncertainty about how much she should reveal. "She's fine," Madison said quickly. "Like Jessica said, we were just talking. Right, Sophie?" The pressure in that question was obvious to anyone paying attention. Madison was giving Sophie a choice: confirm the lie and maintain the fiction that everything was normal, or tell the truth and face whatever consequences might follow. It was the kind of choice that children in Sophie's position faced regularly, the decision between temporary peace and honest vulnerability. Sophie looked between Maria and Madison, her expression cycling through fear, hope, and resignation. Finally, she nodded slightly. "I'm okay." But Maria had spent enough years reading between the lines to recognize the gap between what was said and what was true. Sophie's body language contradicted her words, and the tear stains on her cheeks told a different story than the one she was being pressured to maintain. "Are you sure?" Maria asked gently, ignoring the sharp looks she was receiving from Madison and her companions. "Because if someone is making you uncomfortable, that's not something you have to handle alone." The kindness in her voice seemed to surprise Sophie more than the intervention itself. The girl's eyes filled with fresh tears, and for a moment it seemed like she might tell the truth about what had been happening. But then Madison stepped forward, her expression hardening. "I'm sorry, but who are you exactly?" Madison asked, her tone shifting into the particular form of disdain that wealthy children learn to deploy against those they considered beneath their station. "Because I don't think janitors are supposed to be questioning students about their personal conversations." The dismissal was calculated and cruel, designed to remind Maria of her place in the academy's hierarchy, while simultaneously undermining any authority she might claim in the situation. It was the kind of casual classism that permeated elite institutions, usually unspoken, but always present. Maria felt the familiar sting of being reduced to her job title, of being reminded that her presence was tolerated only as long as she remained invisible and subservient. For 3 years, she had accepted these occasional slights as the price of employment, swallowing her pride in exchange for steady income and the ability to send money home to her family. But something about the way Madison said the word janitor, as if it were synonymous with worthless, combined with Sophie's obvious distress, ignited something that Maria had spent years trying to suppress. She straightened her shoulders and looked directly at Madison, refusing to lower her gaze in the way that was expected. "My name is Maria Santos," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "And you're right that I'm here to clean. But I'm also a human being, and human beings don't walk away when they see someone being hurt." The simplicity of the statement seemed to catch Madison off guard. She had expected defensiveness or apology, the usual responses that adults gave when challenged by students from powerful families. Instead, she was faced with quiet dignity and an unshakable moral position that was difficult to argue against without revealing her own lack of compassion. "Nobody's being hurt," Jessica interjected, but her voice lacked conviction. "We were just having a normal conversation." "Normal conversations don't usually leave people crying," Maria replied, glancing again at Sophie, who was watching this exchange with fascination and growing hope. "Maybe Sophie's just overly sensitive," Chloe suggested. "Maybe she takes things too personally." The victim blaming was so casual, so automatic, that Maria felt a flash of genuine anger. She had heard variations of this excuse her entire life, had watched people justify cruelty by claiming that their targets were simply too weak or emotional to handle normal social interaction. It was a particularly insidious form of gaslighting that left victims doubting their own perceptions while protecting perpetrators from accountability. "Or maybe," Maria said, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before, "some people need to learn the difference between conversation and cruelty." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Madison's face flushed with indignation, not accustomed to being contradicted by anyone, much less someone she considered a servant. The social order that governed Hamilton Academy was being disrupted by a woman in a grey uniform who was supposed to remain invisible and voiceless. "I don't think you understand what's happening here," Madison said, her voice rising slightly. "This is really none of your business." "When I see a child being treated badly, it becomes my business," Maria replied calmly. "That's what decent people do." The implication was clear, and Madison caught it immediately. By suggesting that intervention was what decent people did, Maria was implying that those who stood by and watched cruelty were something less than decent. It was a masterful rhetorical move that shifted the moral ground of the conversation. But Maria wasn't finished. She took another step forward, closing the distance between herself and the 3 girls who had moments before held all the power in this interaction. "Let me tell you something," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the library's acoustics. "I've been watching all of you for 3 years. I've seen how you treat people you think are beneath you. I've seen how you use your family's money and influence to avoid consequences for behavior that would get other children suspended or expelled." Madison's eyes widened with shock. This was not how conversations with service staff were supposed to go. Maria was supposed to apologize for overstepping, retreat to her cart, and pretend this confrontation had never happened. Instead, she was speaking truths that no one was supposed to acknowledge directly. "I've also seen how miserable you actually are," Maria continued, her gaze moving between Madison, Jessica, and Chloe. "I've seen you crying in bathroom stalls when you think no one is looking. I've heard you on phone calls with your parents, begging for attention that never comes. I've watched you treat each other with the same cruelty you show to outsiders because you don't know any other way to feel powerful." The accuracy of these observations was devastating. Maria's invisibility had indeed given her access to private moments of vulnerability, and she was now weaponizing that knowledge in defense of someone who couldn't defend herself. "But Sophie," Maria said, turning to look directly at the girl who had been backed against the bookshelves, "Sophie is different. She's not cruel because she's not empty. She doesn't need to tear other people down because she's not afraid of her own thoughts and feelings." Sophie stared at Maria with an expression of wonder, as if seeing herself clearly for the first time through someone else's eyes. The words weren't just defense. They were recognition of her worth in terms that she had never heard before. "That's why you target her," Maria said, turning back to Madison and her companions. "Not because she's weird or pretentious or antisocial, because she represents something you're afraid you'll never be, genuinely comfortable with who she is." The silence that followed was profound. Madison looked as if she had been slapped, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame. Jessica and Chloe shifted uncomfortably, no longer meeting Maria's steady gaze. "You don't know anything about us," Madison said finally, but the words lacked her usual venom. "I know enough," Maria replied. "I know that hurting other people doesn't make you feel better about yourselves for longer than a few minutes. I know that you'll graduate from this place and go to expensive colleges and get powerful jobs, but you'll still be the same scared little girls who need to make others small to feel big." She paused, letting the weight of that prediction settle over them. "But it doesn't have to be that way," she continued, her voice gentling slightly. "You could choose to be different. You could choose to use your privilege to lift people up instead of tear them down. You could choose to be the kind of people who make the world better instead of worse." It was an olive branch wrapped in a challenge, an offer of redemption that required acknowledgment of wrongdoing. The three girls stood in stunned silence, processing words that no adult had ever spoken to them with such direct honesty. Finally, Madison seemed to recover some of her composure. "Whatever," she said, trying to inject her usual dismissiveness into the word. "Come on, guys. Let's go." But as she turned to leave, she paused and looked back at Maria with an expression that was difficult to read. "You know this isn't over, right? You can't just talk to students like that and expect nothing to happen." It was a threat, but delivered without the usual confidence. Madison was reaching for the power dynamics that typically protected her, but something about Maria's unshakable calm had disrupted those familiar patterns. "I expect exactly what should happen," Maria replied. "I expect people to think about whether they want to be remembered as someone who chose kindness or someone who chose cruelty." Madison's face cycled through several expressions before settling on something that looked almost like respect. She nodded once, sharply, and then walked away with Jessica and Chloe following closely behind. When they were gone, Maria turned her full attention to Sophie, who was still pressed against the bookshelf, as if afraid to believe the confrontation was really over. "Are you okay?" Maria asked gently, the same question she had started with, but now carrying the weight of everything that had passed between them. Sophie nodded slowly, then shook her head, then seemed to give up on trying to categorize her emotional state. "I don't know," she said honestly. I've never seen anyone talk to them like that before." "People should talk to them like that more often," Maria replied. "Maybe then they'd learn that their behavior has consequences." "But won't you get in trouble?" Sophie asked, genuine concern creeping into her voice. "Madison's mom is on the board of trustees. She could have you fired." The worry was touching and perceptive. Sophie understood the power dynamics at play in ways that most children her age would not, likely because her scholarship status had made her acutely aware of how precarious certain positions could be. Maria smiled, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in this confrontation. "Let me worry about that," she said. "Right now, I'm more concerned about making sure you're truly okay." Sophie studied her face as if trying to understand this unexpected kindness. "Why did you help me?" she asked finally. "You don't even know me." It was a reasonable question, and one that Maria herself wasn't entirely sure how to answer. The truth was complicated, rooted in her own experiences with powerlessness and her growing frustration with a system that protected cruelty when it came from the right families. "Because everyone deserves to feel safe at school," she said simply. "And because sometimes adults need to step in when children are being hurt, even if it's not technically our job." Sophie nodded slowly, as if filing away this information for future reference. "What you said about Madison and the others, about them being scared and miserable, is that really true?" Maria considered the question carefully. "What do you think?" "I think—" Sophie paused, gathering her thoughts. "I think maybe everyone's more complicated than they seem on the surface, even the people who are mean to me." It was a remarkably mature response, showing a level of emotional intelligence that most adults would struggle to achieve. Maria felt a surge of protectiveness toward this thoughtful, vulnerable girl who was trying so hard to understand a world that had been largely unkind to her. "That's very wise," Maria said. "But you know what else is true?" Sophie waited expectantly. "Being complicated doesn't excuse being cruel," Maria continued. "Understanding why someone hurts others doesn't mean you have to accept being hurt." This seemed to resonate deeply with Sophie, whose expression shifted as if she were seeing herself and her situation from a new angle. "I always thought I was supposed to just ignore it when people were mean," Sophie said quietly. "My parents said that bullies eventually get bored and move on if you don't react." Maria felt a familiar anger at the inadequacy of adult advice that placed the burden of stopping bullying on its victims. "Your parents love you and want to protect you," she said carefully. "But sometimes ignoring cruelty just teaches cruel people that they can get away with it." "So what should I do?" Sophie asked, and there was something heartbreaking about the way she turned to a woman she barely knew for guidance that she apparently wasn't getting elsewhere. Maria thought about this question, aware that her answer could shape how Sophie navigated not just the remainder of middle school, but potentially her entire relationship with conflict and self-advocacy. "You should know that you have worth that doesn't depend on other people recognizing it," she said finally. "You should know that your intelligence and sensitivity are gifts, not flaws. And you should know that when someone treats you badly, it says something about them, not about you." Sophie absorbed these words with the intensity of someone who had been desperately thirsty and was finally being offered water. "But most importantly," Maria continued, "you should know that you're not alone. There are people who see your value, even if they're not always the loudest voices in the room." For the first time since the confrontation began, Sophie smiled, a small, tentative thing, but genuine. "Thank you," she said simply. Maria nodded and began to turn back to her cart, aware that the morning classes would be starting soon, and she still had work to complete. But Sophie's voice stopped her. "Maria?" The girl's use of her name was surprising and somehow significant. "What you whispered to them about choosing kindness or cruelty. Do you really think people can change?" The question carried layers of meaning. Sophie wasn't just asking about Madison and her friends. She was asking about hope, about the possibility that the world might become a kinder place, about whether her own gentleness was foolish in the environment that seemed to reward aggression. Maria turned back to face her, taking in the girl's earnest expression and the lingering traces of tears on her cheeks. "I think people can choose to change," she said carefully, "but only if they want to, and only if there are consequences for not changing." It was a measured response that acknowledged both the possibility of redemption and the reality that not everyone would choose to take it. Sophie seemed to understand the nuance, nodding thoughtfully. "I hope they do," Sophie said quietly. "Choose to change, I mean." "So do I," Maria replied. "But whether they do or not, you keep being exactly who you are. The world needs more people like you, not fewer." With that, she returned to her cart and began to push it toward the next section of the library. But as she worked, she was acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted. She had broken her own rules about invisibility and non-interference. She had risked her job to defend a child she barely knew. She had spoken truths that adults in this environment usually kept to themselves. And somewhere in the building, Madison Whitmore was probably already planning her revenge. But for the first time in 3 years, Maria Santos felt like she had done something that mattered. She had seen cruelty and chosen to confront it. She had found someone who needed protection and provided it. She had used her voice when silence would have been safer and easier. As she dusted the next shelf, she found herself thinking about the conversation that was probably about to take place in an administrative office somewhere in the building. She thought about phone calls that would be made to parents, about meetings that would be scheduled, about the various ways that powerful families protected their children from the consequences of their actions. But she also thought about Sophie's smile, about the way the girl had straightened her shoulders as she walked away from the rare book section, and about the possibility that one act of courage might inspire another. Maria Santos had spent 3 years being invisible at Hamilton Academy, but on this Tuesday morning in October, she had chosen to be seen. And nothing would ever be the same again. The phone call came at exactly 11:43 that morning, just as Maria was finishing the second-floor bathrooms. She heard her name being announced over the intercom system, requesting her immediate presence in the administrative wing. The tone was carefully neutral, the kind of professional courtesy that masked underlying tension. Maria had been expecting this summons since the moment Madison Whitmore walked away from the library confrontation, but that didn't make it any less unsettling. She made her way through corridors that suddenly felt different, as if her act of defiance had shifted the very architecture of the building. Students she passed seemed to look at her with new awareness, though she couldn't determine whether their expressions held curiosity, respect, or something more complicated. Word traveled fast in elite institutions, especially when that word involved someone stepping outside their designated role. The administrative wing of Hamilton Academy was designed to intimidate. Marble floors gave way to thick carpeting that muffled footsteps and created an atmosphere of hushed importance. Oil paintings of the school's founders gazed down from walnut-paneled walls, their expressions stern and judgmental. The furniture was all leather and mahogany, built to last centuries and designed to remind visitors that they were in the presence of institutional power. Maria had only been in this section of the building a handful of times during her 3 years of employment, usually to deliver cleaning supplies or address specific maintenance issues. She had never been summoned for a meeting, had never been asked to sit in one of the imposing chairs that faced the various administrative desks. As she walked toward the principal's office, she felt acutely aware of her grey uniform, her worn sneakers, and the way her presence seemed to disturb the careful elegance of the space. Dr. Patricia Hendricks had been Hamilton Academy's principal for 12 years, a tenure that had seen the school's endowment grow substantially while maintaining its reputation for academic excellence. She was a woman in her late 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe chignon and the kind of understated jewelry that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. Her office was a study in controlled power, with diplomas from prestigious universities arranged on one wall and photographs of her with various political and business leaders on another. She was not alone when Maria entered. Seated in one of the leather chairs was Victoria Whitmore, Madison's mother, and the pharmaceutical heiress whose donations had funded the Academy's new science wing. Mrs. Whitmore was younger than Dr. Hendricks, but carried herself with the particular brand of authority that came from never having to worry about money. Her blonde hair was styled in the kind of effortless waves that actually required considerable professional maintenance, and her tailored suit probably cost more than Maria made in 6 months. The third person in the room was someone Maria didn't recognize, a man in his early 40s wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He had the sharp, predatory look of someone accustomed to winning arguments through intimidation and superior resources. When Dr. Hendricks introduced him as Mrs. Whitmore's attorney, Maria's stomach dropped with the realization that this situation was more serious than she had anticipated. "Please, have a seat," Dr. Hendricks said, gesturing toward the remaining chair. Her tone was carefully polite, but Maria could sense the underlying tension in the room. This was not going to be a casual conversation about appropriate boundaries or professional development. This was something much more consequential. Maria sat down, acutely aware of how the expensive leather creaked under her weight. She folded her hands in her lap and tried to project a calm she didn't feel, drawing on years of experience in maintaining composure when faced with authority figures who held her livelihood in their hands. "I'm sure you know why we've asked you here, Doctor," Hendricks began, settling behind her imposing desk. "We've received some concerning reports about an incident that occurred in the library this morning. An incident where you apparently verbally attacked my daughter and her friends," Mrs. Whitmore added, her voice carrying the particular chill that wealthy parents reserved for those they considered beneath their station. "An incident where you overstepped your authority as an employee of this institution and involved yourself in matters that were none of your concern." The characterization stung because it was so deliberately twisted. What Maria had witnessed was clear harassment, and what she had done was intervene to protect a vulnerable child. But she could see how the narrative was being reframed, how her act of courage was being transformed into an act of aggression by people who had the power to control the story. "I witnessed your daughter and her friends making another student cry," Maria said quietly, keeping her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I felt it was appropriate to intervene when I saw someone being hurt." The attorney leaned forward slightly, his pen poised over a legal pad. "According to our understanding of the situation, you approached a group of students who were having a private conversation and proceeded to lecture them about their character and behavior. Is that accurate?" The question was phrased as a trap, designed to make her sound either dishonest if she denied it or inappropriate if she confirmed it. Maria had encountered this kind of legal maneuvering before, the way that lawyers could twist facts to serve their clients' interests while maintaining plausible deniability about their own manipulation. "I approached a group of students because one of them was obviously distressed," Maria replied carefully. "When I asked if there was a problem, it became clear that the conversation was not as private or innocent as you're suggesting." "That's not how my daughter described it," Mrs. Whitmore interjected, her voice rising slightly. "Madison said that you were hostile and accusatory from the moment you inserted yourself into their discussion. She said you made personal attacks against her character and threatened her with consequences." The revision of events was so complete that Maria almost wondered if they were talking about the same incident, but she recognized the pattern from her own childhood, the way that wealthy families protected their children by rewriting reality when necessary. Madison's tears of shame and confusion had been transformed into righteous indignation, her moment of vulnerability recast as victimization. "I told the girls that hurting other people doesn't make anyone feel better about themselves," Maria said, choosing her words carefully. "I suggested that they could choose to use their influence to help rather than harm. If that felt threatening, it might be because they recognized some truth in it." The attorney made a note on his pad, and Mrs. Whitmore's face flushed with anger. "How dare you," she said, her carefully modulated voice cracking slightly. "How dare you presume to lecture my daughter about morality or character? You're a janitor. Your job is to clean floors, not to psychoanalyze children or make judgments about their behavior." The dismissal was calculated to wound, designed to remind Maria of her place in the social hierarchy, while simultaneously undermining any moral authority she might claim. It was the same tactic Madison had used, the casual deployment of class-based contempt as a weapon against those who dared to challenge the established order. But something had changed in Maria during the library confrontation. The act of standing up for Sophie had awakened something that years of careful invisibility had suppressed, and she found herself unwilling to accept humiliation as the price of employment. "My job is to maintain a clean and safe environment for learning," she replied, meeting Mrs. Whitmore's gaze directly. "When I see children being emotionally harmed, that threatens the safety of the learning environment. So yes, it becomes part of my job." Dr. Hendricks cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension between the two women. "Maria, I think what Mrs. Whitmore is trying to say is that there are established protocols for handling student conflicts. If you witnessed behavior that concerned you, the appropriate response would have been to report it to a teacher or administrator, rather than intervening directly." It was a reasonable point delivered in a diplomatic tone, the kind of institutional compromise that acknowledged the validity of Maria's concerns, while still maintaining the hierarchical boundaries that kept the academy functioning smoothly. But Maria had seen too much during her 3 years of invisibility to accept the fiction that established protocols were adequate for addressing the complex realities of adolescent cruelty. "With respect, Dr. Hendricks," Maria said, "how many reports of bullying have resulted in meaningful consequences for students whose families donate generously to this school?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone in the room to confront truths that were usually left unspoken. The attorney's pen stopped moving, Mrs. Whitmore's face went pale, and Dr. Hendricks looked as if she had been physically struck. "That's completely inappropriate," the attorney said quickly, his professional training kicking in to deflect the uncomfortable implication. "You're making unfounded accusations about the integrity of this institution's disciplinary procedures." "I'm making observations based on 3 years of watching those procedures in action," Maria replied calmly. "I've seen students like Madison face minimal consequences for behavior that would result in suspension or expulsion if it came from children whose families couldn't afford to donate new buildings." Mrs. Whitmore stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is outrageous," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "I will not sit here and listen to some cleaning woman make accusations about my daughter's character or my family's influence." The phrase "some cleaning woman" was delivered with particular venom, designed to reduce Maria to nothing more than her job function, while simultaneously expressing contempt for that function. It was classism in its purest form, the automatic assumption that economic status determined human worth, and that service work was inherently degrading. "Mrs. Whitmore," Dr. Hendricks said, her tone carrying a warning. "Perhaps we should take a moment to know." Mrs. Whitmore interrupted, turning to face the principal with blazing eyes. "I want to know what this school intends to do about an employee who has clearly overstepped her authority and made personal attacks against students. Because if the answer is nothing, then my family will need to reconsider our relationship with this institution." The threat was unsubtle but effective. Hamilton Academy depended on donations from families like the Whitmores to maintain its facilities, fund its programs, and attract the kind of faculty that made it competitive with other elite schools. Losing a major donor over what could be characterized as a personnel issue would be difficult to explain to the Board of Trustees. Maria watched Dr. Hendricks' face as the principal calculated the political and financial implications of the situation. She could see the internal struggle between institutional integrity and practical necessity, between supporting an employee who had acted courageously and protecting relationships that kept the school solvent. "I think perhaps we're all a bit emotional right now, Dr. Hendricks said finally, her diplomatic training reasserting itself. Maria, I'm going to ask you to take the remainder of the day off while we review the situation and determine the appropriate next steps. It was a suspension disguised as a courtesy, a way of removing Maria from the building while the administration figured out how to resolve the conflict without losing either an employee or a donor. Maria had expected something like this, but that didn't make it any less disheartening to see how quickly institutional support evaporated when faced with economic pressure. What about Sophie Hamilton? Maria asked, making one last attempt to focus attention on the actual victim in this situation. What steps are being taken to ensure that she feels safe and supported at this school? The question seemed to catch everyone off guard, as if they had forgotten that the original incident involved a child who had been brought to tears by her peers' cruelty. Mrs. Whitmore looked genuinely confused by the reference, while Dr. Hendricks shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Sophie's situation will be addressed through appropriate channels, the principal said vaguely. But right now our focus needs to be on resolving the concerns that have been raised about your conduct. It was a deflection that revealed everything about the institution's priorities. The child who had been harmed was relegated to secondary importance, while the adults focused on managing the political and legal implications of someone actually trying to help her. Maria stood up slowly, maintaining her dignity despite the circumstances. I understand, she said quietly. Should I expect to hear from you tomorrow about my employment status? Dr. Hendricks nodded, looking genuinely uncomfortable with the situation she found herself managing. We'll be in touch once we've had a chance to review everything more thoroughly. As Maria walked toward the door, she could feel the weight of 3 sets of eyes following her movement. She paused with her hand on the doorknob and turned back to face Mrs. Whitmore directly. Your daughter is not a bad person, she said quietly. But she's learning to be one, and the lessons she's getting at home and at school are teaching her that cruelty is acceptable as long as you have enough money and influence to avoid consequences. Mrs. Whitmore's face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked almost like uncertainty. For just a moment, the carefully constructed facade of righteous parental protection cracked, and Maria glimpsed something that might have been doubt. Madison is a good girl, Mrs. Whitmore said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. She could be, Maria replied. But good isn't something you inherit or purchase, it's something you choose every day in how you treat other people. With that, she opened the door and walked out, leaving behind the leather chairs, the oil paintings, and the 3 adults who would decide her professional fate based on calculations that had nothing to do with right or wrong. The hallway felt different as she made her way back toward the service areas of the building. Students were changing classes, filling the corridors with their voices and energy, but Maria felt separated from it all by an invisible barrier. She was no longer simply the invisible cleaning woman moving through their world unnoticed. She was someone who had challenged their social order, who had spoken truths that adults usually kept hidden, who had risked her livelihood to protect one of their own. As she gathered her personal items from the supply closet that served as her base of operations, Maria reflected on how quickly life could change. This morning, she had been a woman who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility, someone who cleaned around conversations and pretended not to notice the casual cruelties that occurred in the spaces between official supervision. Now she was someone who had chosen to be seen, who had spoken up when silence would have been safer, who had put her job on the line to defend a child she barely knew. The transformation felt both terrifying and liberating, as if she had finally acknowledged a part of herself that she had been suppressing for years. Her phone buzzed as she was cleaning out her locker, a text message from an unknown number. Thank you for standing up for me today. I know it probably got you in trouble, but I wanted you to know that it mattered. Sophie. Maria stared at the message for a long time, feeling a mixture of warmth and sadness wash over her. Sophie had somehow gotten her number, probably from the employee directory that students occasionally accessed for legitimate reasons, and had taken the risk of reaching out to express gratitude that she probably shouldn't have felt obligated to give. She typed back carefully, "You're worth standing up for. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The response came quickly.
Are you going to be okay? Madison was telling people that her mom was going to get you fired. The concern in the message was touching, especially coming from a child who had her own problems to worry about. Maria found herself smiling despite the uncertainty of her situation. "I'll be fine," she wrote back. "You focus on taking care of yourself." But as she walked out of Hamilton Academy that afternoon, Maria wasn't entirely sure that her reassurance was truthful. She had savings, but not enough to sustain her for more than a few months without income. She had skills, but cleaning jobs that paid as well as this one were rare and usually required connections she didn't possess. She had principles, but principles didn't pay rent or put food on the table. The October air felt crisp against her face as she stood on the academy's front steps, looking back at the imposing building that had been her workplace for 3 years. She had entered this morning as a woman who had learned to survive by making herself small and invisible. She was leaving as someone who had discovered that some things were more important than survival. Her apartment was a modest one-bedroom in a neighborhood that had been slowly gentrifying around her, pushing rents higher while providing few benefits to long-time residents like herself. She had moved there after her divorce, when starting over had required accepting a much smaller life than the one she had imagined for herself. The furniture was second-hand but well-maintained, the walls decorated with photographs of family members in Guatemala, and a few pieces of art she had collected from local street fairs. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the afternoon sun filter through the leaves of the oak tree that grew in front of her building. For the first time in months she had nowhere she needed to be, no schedule to maintain, no tasks to complete before the end of the day. The freedom felt strange and unsettling, as if she had forgotten how to exist without the structure of constant work. Her phone rang as the sun was beginning to set, an unknown number that made her heart race with the possibility that Dr.
Hendricks had reached a decision about her employment status. But when she answered, the voice on the other end was not one she had expected to hear. "Miss Santos, this is James Hamilton. I believe you met my granddaughter Sophie earlier today." The name hit her like a physical blow. James Hamilton was not just Sophie's grandfather. He was the founder of Hamilton Academy, the man whose vision and initial funding had created the institution that now bore his name. More importantly, he was also the CEO of Hamilton Industries, a technology conglomerate that had made him one of the wealthiest men in the state. Maria had seen his photograph in the Academy's main hallway, a formal portrait that showed a distinguished man in his 70s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes. She had read about him occasionally in the business section of the newspaper, usually in connection with philanthropic endeavors or major corporate acquisitions. She had never imagined that she would have occasion to speak with him directly, much less under circumstances like these. "Mr. Hamilton," she managed to say, her voice betraying her surprise. Yes, I did meet Sophie today. She called me this afternoon," he said, his voice carrying the particular authority that came from decades of making decisions that affected thousands of people. "She told me about what happened in the library and about how you intervened to protect her from some rather unpleasant treatment by her classmates." Maria wasn't sure how to respond. She had no idea what Sophie might have told her grandfather, or how much detail the girl had provided about the confrontation with Madison and her friends. She also wasn't sure whether this phone call represented an opportunity or another form of trouble. "Sophie is a remarkable young woman," Maria said carefully. "I was concerned about how upset she seemed, so I felt it was appropriate to check on her welfare." "According to Sophie, you did considerably more than check on her welfare," Mr. Hamilton replied, and Maria could hear something that might have been amusement in his voice. "She said you gave those girls quite a lecture about character and moral responsibility." The way he phrased it made Maria wonder if he approved or disapproved of her actions. Wealthy families often closed ranks when their children were criticized, regardless of the validity of those criticisms. She had no reason to assume that Sophie's grandfather would be different from Madison's mother in his protective instincts. "I told them that they had choices about how to treat other people," Maria said honestly. I suggested that they might want to choose kindness over cruelty. And how did they respond to that suggestion? The question seemed genuinely curious rather than accusatory, which encouraged Maria to provide a more complete answer than she might have otherwise. They seemed surprised that anyone would challenge their behavior, she said. I think they're accustomed to adults either ignoring their conduct or making excuses for it. Mr. Hamilton was quiet for several seconds, and Maria began to worry that she had overstepped again, that her honesty was going to create additional problems for herself or for Sophie. Ms. Santos, he said finally, I wonder if you might be available to meet with me tomorrow morning. I'd like to discuss this situation in more detail, and I have a proposition that might interest you. The request caught Maria completely off guard. She had expected many possible outcomes from her confrontation with Madison and her friends, but a meeting with one of the most powerful men in the state had not been among them. Yes, I think that would be possible, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Where would you like to meet? My office downtown, he replied, giving her an address that she recognized as one of the city's most prestigious business buildings. Shall we say 10 o'clock? After she hung up, Maria sat in her apartment trying to process what had just happened. In the span of a single day, she had broken 3 years of careful invisibility, confronted a group of privileged teenagers about their bullying behavior, been suspended from her job, and received a mysterious invitation from one of the city's most influential businessmen. She spent the evening researching James Hamilton online, trying to understand the man who had requested a meeting with her. What she learned was both impressive and intimidating. He had built Hamilton Industries from a small family business into a multinational corporation over the course of 4 decades, earning a reputation for innovative thinking and ethical business practices. He was known for his philanthropy, particularly in education and social services, and for his willingness to speak publicly about corporate responsibility and social justice issues. But he was also known for being demanding and exacting, someone who expected excellence from everyone around him and had little patience for mediocrity or dishonesty. The articles she read described him as brilliant but intimidating, generous but demanding, someone who inspired both loyalty and fear in equal measure. As she prepared for bed, Maria found herself thinking about Sophie, wondering how the girl was processing the day's events and whether the attention her grandfather's involvement might bring would ultimately help or harm her social situation at school. She also thought about Madison, Jessica, and Chloe, trying to imagine how they would react to learning that their behavior had come to the attention of someone with the power to influence their futures in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. But mostly, she thought about her own choices and their consequences. She had spent years learning to survive by avoiding conflict, by making herself small and unnoticed, by accepting humiliation as the price of employment. Today, she had chosen a different path, one that valued courage over safety and principle over pragmatism. Tomorrow, she would learn whether that choice had been wise or foolish, whether standing up for Sophie Hamilton had opened new possibilities or closed familiar doors forever. The last thing she did before falling asleep was to look at Sophie's text message again, at those simple words of gratitude that had meant more to her than any performance evaluation or employee recognition she had ever received. Whatever consequences tomorrow might bring, she knew that she would make the same choice again. Because some things were more important than keeping your head down and staying invisible. Some things required you to step into the light, even when you weren't sure what you would find there. The Hamilton Industries building rose 43 stories above the city center, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun like a beacon of corporate power. Maria had passed this structure countless times during her years in the city, but she had never imagined entering it, much less taking the express elevator to the executive floor where decisions affecting thousands of lives were made daily. She had chosen her most professional outfit, a navy blue dress she had purchased for job interviews 3 years ago and rarely had occasion to wear. Her shoes were comfortable but polished, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, her makeup minimal but carefully applied. She wanted to present herself with dignity while remaining authentic to who she was, a balance that felt increasingly precarious as the elevator climbed higher into the rarefied atmosphere of executive leadership. The 42nd floor was a study in understated luxury, where every surface gleamed with careful maintenance and every detail spoke of resources beyond most people's comprehension. The reception area featured floor-to-ceiling windows that provided breathtaking views of the city below, while contemporary artwork adorned walls paneled in rich walnut. The furniture was modern but comfortable, designed to impress visitors while keeping them at ease during what were often high-stakes negotiations. Maria announced herself to the receptionist, a woman in her 30s whose professional demeanor suggested she was accustomed to managing the schedules and expectations of extremely powerful people. She was asked to wait in a seating area where she found herself surrounded by magazines focused on business leadership, technology innovation, and philanthropic endeavors. The coffee table featured annual reports from various Hamilton Industries subsidiaries, each one bound in expensive materials and filled with statistics that demonstrated the company's global reach and financial success. As she waited, Maria found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been a cleaning woman, whose greatest concern was completing her assigned tasks without drawing unwanted attention. Now she was sitting in one of the city's most exclusive office buildings, preparing to meet with a man whose decisions influenced markets and shaped communities across multiple states. The transformation felt surreal, as if she were living someone else's life or participating in an elaborate dream from which she might wake at any moment. But the leather chair beneath her was solid and real. The city sprawling below the windows was familiar and concrete, and the nervous energy in her stomach was entirely authentic. "Ms. Santos?" The voice belonged to a woman in her 40s, wearing an impeccably tailored suit and carrying herself with the confident efficiency of someone who managed complex schedules and sensitive information. "Mr. Hamilton will see you now." The walk to James Hamilton's office took them down a hallway lined with photographs documenting the company's history and philanthropic initiatives. Maria glimpsed images of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, charity fundraisers and community development projects, all featuring the man she was about to meet alongside various politicians, business leaders and community activists. The photographs told a story of engagement and responsibility that went beyond mere profit generation, suggesting a leader who understood the broader implications of corporate power. James Hamilton's office was even more impressive than Maria had anticipated, occupying a corner of the building that provided panoramic views in two directions. The space was large enough to accommodate multiple seating areas, including a formal conference table, a more casual arrangement of armchairs near the windows, and an imposing desk that managed to project authority without creating unnecessary intimidation. The decor balanced modern sophistication with personal touches, including family photographs and what appeared to be artwork created by children, presumably including pieces made by Sophie. The man himself was shorter than Maria had expected from his photographs, but his presence filled the room in ways that had nothing to do with physical stature. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his suit obviously custom-tailored, and his blue eyes held the sharp intelligence that had built an empire from modest beginnings. When he stood to greet her, his handshake was firm without being aggressive, and his smile seemed genuinely warm rather than professionally manufactured. "Miss Santos, thank you for coming," he said, his voice carrying the same authority she had heard over the phone, but tempered with something that might have been kindness. "Please have a seat wherever you're comfortable." She chose one of the armchairs near the windows, partly because the view was spectacular, and partly because the informal seating arrangement felt less threatening than the formal conference table or the imposing desk. Mr. Hamilton took the chair across from her, close enough for comfortable conversation, but far enough away to avoid any sense of intrusion into her personal space. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of having my assistant research your background," he said without preamble. "I like to know who I'm dealing with, especially when that person has made such an impression on my granddaughter." The admission should have felt invasive, but something about his straightforward delivery made it seem more like professional thoroughness than personal violation. Maria found herself curious about what that research might have revealed, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the details. "What I learned," Mr. Hamilton continued, "was quite impressive. You immigrated to this country 12 years ago with limited English and no family connections. You worked multiple jobs while attending community college, earned an associate degree in early childhood development, and maintained a 3.8 GPA despite working full-time throughout your studies." Maria felt heat creep up her neck as he recited details of her life that she rarely discussed with anyone. The struggles of those early years felt both distant and immediate, memories of exhaustion and determination that had shaped her into the person she was today. "You were married for 4 years to a man who, according to court records, became increasingly controlling and eventually physically abusive. You left that marriage with essentially nothing, rebuilding your life from scratch while dealing with the legal and emotional aftermath of domestic violence." The clinical recitation of her most painful experiences should have felt humiliating, but instead, Maria found herself appreciating his matter-of-fact tone. He was acknowledging her history without judgment or pity, treating her past as information rather than ammunition. "For the last 3 years, you've worked at Hamilton Academy, where you've been consistently rated as an exemplary employee. You arrive early, stay late when needed, and have never had a single complaint filed against your work performance or professional conduct." He paused, leaning back in his chair and studying her face with eyes that seemed to see more than most people revealed. "What the records don't show," he continued, "is why someone with your educational background and obvious intelligence chose to work as a cleaning woman rather than pursuing the teaching career that your degree was designed to support." It was a fair question, and one that Maria had asked herself countless times over the past 3 years. The answer was complicated, involving confidence eroded by an abusive marriage, financial pressures that made steady employment more important than career advancement, and a growing belief that she was safer when she remained invisible. "Teaching requires being seen," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "After my marriage ended, I wasn't ready to be seen. Cleaning allowed me to work around people without having to engage with them directly. It felt safer." Mr. Hamilton nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "And yet yesterday, you chose to be very visible indeed. You chose to engage directly with students who were causing harm, despite knowing that such engagement could jeopardize your employment." "Sophie was crying," Maria said simply. "Someone needed to help her, and you felt that someone should be you?" The question wasn't accusatory, but it demanded honesty about motivations that Maria was still trying to understand herself. Why had she stepped out of the shadows for Sophie Hamilton? What had compelled her to risk everything for a child she barely knew? "I felt that if I didn't help her, no one would," she admitted. "I've watched that pattern play out too many times at your academy. Certain students get away with behavior that would never be tolerated from others, and their victims are left to handle the consequences alone." "You're suggesting that Hamilton Academy has systemic problems with how it addresses bullying among students from influential families?" The directness of his question caught Maria off guard. She had expected him to defend the institution that bore his name, to minimize the problems she had observed, or to suggest that her perspective as a cleaning woman was limited and unreliable. "I'm saying that money has a way of making problems disappear before they can be properly addressed," she replied carefully. "And children learn from watching how adults handle conflicts. If they see that wealth and influence can shield them from consequences, they learn to use those advantages to avoid accountability. Mr. Hamilton was quiet for several minutes, his gaze fixed on something beyond the windows. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Sophie's mother died when she was 7, he said quietly. "My daughter Caroline was killed by a drunk driver. A 19-year-old kid from a wealthy family who had been arrested twice before for similar incidents, but never faced serious consequences because his parents. Lawyers always managed to get the charges reduced or dismissed." The revelation hit Maria like a physical blow. She had known that Sophie lived with her grandfather rather than her parents, but she had assumed it was a matter of convenience or preference rather than tragedy.
Hamilton's expression shifted slightly, taking on a hardness that reminded Maria of his reputation as a demanding leader who didn't tolerate incompetence or resistance. "Dr. Hendricks will be taking early retirement at the end of this academic year," he said simply. "The Board of Trustees has decided that the Academy needs new leadership, someone who shares our renewed commitment to the institution's founding principles." The implication was clear. The changes would be comprehensive, affecting not just policies and procedures, but also the personnel responsible for implementing them. Maria was being offered not just a job, but a chance to be part of a fundamental transformation of an institution that had lost its way. "I need time to think about this," she said, recognizing that the decision would reshape her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Of course, Mr. Hamilton replied. "But I should mention that time is somewhat limited. The current academic year is already in progress, and the problems you identified yesterday are unlikely to resolve themselves while we debate administrative restructuring." It was gentle pressure, but pressure nonetheless. He was reminding her that every day she delayed her decision was another day, that students like Sophie would continue to suffer while their tormentors faced minimal consequences. "What about Madison Whitmore and her friends?" Maria asked, curious about how the immediate catalyst for this conversation would be addressed. What consequences will they face for their behavior? Mr. Hamilton's smile held no warmth. "Mrs. Whitmore called me last evening, quite upset about her daughter's treatment at the hands of a school employee. She demanded that I use my influence to ensure that you were terminated immediately." Maria felt her stomach clench with anxiety, despite knowing that this conversation suggested a different outcome than the one Mrs. Whitmore had demanded. "I informed Mrs. Whitmore that Hamilton Academy would indeed be making personnel changes in response to the incident involving her daughter," he continued. "I also informed her that if Madison's behavior doesn't improve immediately and dramatically, the Academy will need to reconsider whether she's a good fit for our educational community." The reversal was stunning in its completeness. Madison's mother had expected her complaints to result in Maria's firing, but instead had triggered a re-evaluation of her own daughter's enrollment status. "The Whitmore family has been generous donors to the Academy," Maria observed, wondering how the loss of that financial support would affect the institution's operations. "The Whitmore family's donations will be missed," Mr. Hamilton acknowledged. "But they won't be missed more than the Academy's integrity and mission. I'd rather run a smaller school that actually develops character than a larger one that merely warehouses privileged children while they learn to abuse their advantages." The conviction in his voice reminded Maria of why she had respected him even before meeting him. This was a man who had built a business empire while maintaining ethical standards, who understood that some things were more valuable than money. "If I accept this position," she said carefully, "I want to be clear about my approach. I believe in consequences that actually change behavior, not just symbolic gestures that allow everyone to pretend problems have been solved." "What kind of consequences did you have in mind?" Maria thought about her observations from 3 years of watching the Academy's social dynamics play out in hallways and bathrooms, during lunch periods and after-school activities. Community service that actually serves the community, not just prestigious volunteer opportunities that look good on college applications, she said. Conflict resolution that requires genuine accountability rather than superficial apologies. and social activities that bring different groups of students together instead of reinforcing existing hierarchies. Mr. Hamilton nodded approvingly. Those sound like exactly the kinds of changes the Academy needs. What else? I want to create mentorship programs between older and younger students, with real training for the mentors and ongoing supervision to ensure the relationships are healthy, she continued, warming to the subject as she spoke. I want to establish clear protocols for reporting and addressing harassment that don't require victims to navigate complex bureaucracies or face their tormentors in mediated conversations. And for the staff, training for all employees on recognizing signs of bullying and harassment, including the subtle forms that often go unaddressed, clear expectations that everyone from janitors to department heads has a responsibility to protect student welfare, and regular surveys that give students anonymous ways to report problems without fear of retaliation. The comprehensive nature of her vision seemed to energize Mr. Hamilton, whose expression grew more animated as she outlined her ideas. This was clearly someone who appreciated strategic thinking and systematic approaches to complex problems. "When can you start?" he asked. The question caught Maria off guard, despite the trajectory of their conversation. She had been so focused on articulating her vision that she hadn't quite processed the reality that he was offering her the opportunity to implement it. "I need to give notice at my current position," she said, then remembered her suspended status. "Actually, I'm not sure what my current employment status is." Mr. Hamilton's smile returned, this time with genuine warmth. "Your current employment status is former Hamilton Academy custodial staff member. Your new employment status, if you accept my offer, is Director of Student Development and Campus Culture starting Monday morning." The timeline was aggressive, leaving almost no time for the kind of careful transition that Maria would have preferred. But she also recognized that problems like the one she had witnessed yesterday couldn't wait for convenient scheduling. "What about my lack of administrative experience?" she asked, voicing one of her remaining concerns. "I've never managed staff or developed institutional policies." "You'll have support," he assured her. "My assistant will help you navigate the administrative aspects of the position while you focus on the substantive work, and I'll be available for consultation whenever you need guidance or authorization for significant changes." The safety net was reassuring, but Maria still felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was proposing. Yesterday she had been a cleaning woman whose greatest responsibility was maintaining floor shine and restroom supplies.
Hamilton's expression shifted slightly, taking on a hardness that reminded Maria of his reputation as a demanding leader who didn't tolerate incompetence or resistance. "Dr. Hendricks will be taking early retirement at the end of this academic year," he said simply. "The Board of Trustees has decided that the Academy needs new leadership, someone who shares our renewed commitment to the institution's founding principles." The implication was clear. The changes would be comprehensive, affecting not just policies and procedures, but also the personnel responsible for implementing them. Maria was being offered not just a job, but a chance to be part of a fundamental transformation of an institution that had lost its way. "I need time to think about this," she said, recognizing that the decision would reshape her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Of course," Mr. Hamilton replied, "but I should mention that time is somewhat limited. The current academic year is already in progress, and the problems you identified yesterday are unlikely to resolve themselves while we debate administrative restructuring." It was gentle pressure, but pressure nonetheless. He was reminding her that every day she delayed her decision was another day that students like Sophie would continue to suffer while their tormentors faced minimal consequences. "What about Madison Whitmore and her friends?" Maria asked, curious about how the immediate catalyst for this conversation would be addressed. "What consequences will they face for their behavior?" Mr. Hamilton's smile held no warmth. "Mrs. Whitmore called me last evening, quite upset about her daughter's treatment at the hands of a school employee. She demanded that I use my influence to ensure that you were terminated immediately." Maria felt her stomach clench with anxiety, despite knowing that this conversation suggested a different outcome than the one Mrs. Whitmore had demanded. "I informed Mrs. Whitmore that Hamilton Academy would indeed be making personnel changes in response to the incident involving her daughter," he continued. "I also informed her that if Madison's behavior doesn't improve immediately and dramatically, the Academy will need to reconsider whether she's a good fit for our educational community." The reversal was stunning in its completeness. Madison's mother had expected her complaints to result in Maria's firing, but instead had triggered a re-evaluation of her own daughter's enrollment status. "The Whitmore family has been generous donors to the Academy," Maria observed, wondering how the loss of that financial support would affect the institution's operations. "The Whitmore family's donations will be missed," Mr. Hamilton acknowledged, "but they won't be missed more than the Academy's integrity and mission. I'd rather run a smaller school that actually develops character than a larger one that merely warehouses privileged children while they learn to abuse their advantages." The conviction in his voice reminded Maria of why she had respected him even before meeting him. This was a man who had built a business empire while maintaining ethical standards, who understood that some things were more valuable than money. "If I accept this position," she said carefully, "I want to be clear about my approach. I believe in consequences that actually change behavior, not just symbolic gestures that allow everyone to pretend problems have been solved." "What kind of consequences did you have in mind?" Maria thought about her observations from 3 years of watching the Academy's social dynamics play out in hallways and bathrooms during lunch periods and after-school activities. "Community service that actually serves the community, not just prestigious volunteer opportunities that look good on college applications," she said. "Conflict resolution that requires genuine accountability rather than superficial apologies. And social activities that bring different groups of students together instead of reinforcing existing hierarchies." Mr. Hamilton nodded approvingly. "Those sound like exactly the kinds of changes the Academy needs." "What else?" "I want to create mentorship programs between older and younger students, with real training for the mentors and ongoing supervision to ensure the relationships are healthy," she continued, warming to the subject as she spoke. "I want to establish clear protocols for reporting and addressing harassment that don't require victims to navigate complex bureaucracies or face their tormentors in mediated conversations. And for the staff, training for all employees on recognizing signs of bullying and harassment, including the subtle forms that often go unaddressed. Clear expectations that everyone from janitors to department heads has a responsibility to protect student welfare. And regular surveys that give students anonymous ways to report problems without fear of retaliation." The comprehensive nature of her vision seemed to energize Mr. Hamilton, whose expression grew more animated as she outlined her ideas. This was clearly someone who appreciated strategic thinking and systematic approaches to complex problems. "When can you start?" he asked. The question caught Maria off guard, despite the trajectory of their conversation. She had been so focused on articulating her vision that she hadn't quite processed the reality that he was offering her the opportunity to implement it. I need to give notice at my current position," she said, then remembered her suspended status. "Actually, I'm not sure what my current employment status is." Mr. Hamilton's smile returned, this time with genuine warmth. "Your current employment status is former Hamilton Academy custodial staff member. Your new employment status, if you accept my offer, is Director of Student Development and Campus Culture, starting Monday morning." The timeline was aggressive, leaving almost no time for the kind of careful transition that Maria would have preferred. But she also recognized that problems like the one she had witnessed yesterday couldn't wait for convenient scheduling. "What about my lack of administrative experience?" she asked, voicing one of her remaining concerns. "I've never managed staff or developed institutional policies." "You'll have support," he assured her. My assistant will help you navigate the administrative aspects of the position while you focus on the substantive work. And I'll be available for consultation whenever you need guidance or authorization for significant changes. The safety net was reassuring, but Maria still felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was proposing. Yesterday, she'd been a cleaning woman whose greatest responsibility was maintaining floor shine and restroom supplies. Today, she was being offered the chance to reshape an entire educational culture. "I accept," she said quietly, the words carrying weight that seemed to settle over both of them. Mr. Hamilton stood and extended his hand again, this time not in greeting but in partnership. "Welcome to the leadership team, Ms. Santos. I think you're going to make a remarkable difference in many young lives." As Maria shook his hand, she found herself thinking about Sophie, about the tears that had started this entire chain of events, and about the possibility that other children might be spared similar pain through the changes they were about to implement. "There's one more thing," Mr. Hamilton said as she prepared to leave. "Sophie asked me to invite you to dinner this weekend. She wants to show you her poetry and hear your thoughts about some ideas she has for improving student life at the academy." The invitation was touching, a reminder that beyond all the administrative complexity and institutional reform, this was fundamentally about relationships between human beings who cared about each other's welfare. "I would love to have dinner with Sophie," Maria replied, "and I'm very interested in hearing her ideas." As she left the Hamilton Industries building that morning, Maria felt as if she were walking into a completely different life than the one she had known just 24 hours earlier. The city looked the same, but her place in it had changed fundamentally. She was no longer someone who survived by staying invisible, someone who cleaned around the edges of other people's lives. She was someone with the power to protect vulnerable children, someone with the authority to implement meaningful change, someone whose voice would be heard and whose decisions would matter. The transformation was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Her phone buzzed with a text message as she reached the street level. It was from Sophie. "My grandfather told me the good news. I'm so excited to work with you on making school better for everyone. Thank you for seeing me when everyone else just looked right through." Maria smiled as she read the message, remembering the girl's tear-streaked face in the library and the courage it had taken to stand up to her tormentors. Sophie hadn't just been saved by Maria's intervention. She had been the catalyst for changes that would benefit countless other students who found themselves on the margins of an elite institution. The following Monday morning, Maria walked through the doors of Hamilton Academy for the first time as Director of Student Development and Campus Culture. She wore a professional suit rather than a grey uniform, carried a briefcase instead of cleaning supplies, and moved through corridors that had once been her domain as an invisible presence. Students stared as she passed, recognizing her face but confused by her transformation. Teachers whispered among themselves, uncertain how to relate to someone who had crossed the invisible boundaries that typically separated staff categories. Administrators watched nervously, aware that her new position carried the full authority of the Academy's founder and primary benefactor. But Maria's attention was focused on finding Sophie, on making sure that the girl who had inspired this transformation knew that she was no longer alone in navigating the complex social dynamics of adolescent cruelty and privilege. She found Sophie in the library, sitting in the same area where the confrontation with Madison had occurred just a week earlier. The girl was reading, as always, but she looked up with a brilliant smile when Maria approached. "Miss Santos," Sophie said, then corrected herself with obvious delight. "I mean Director Santos." "Maria is fine," she replied, taking the seat across from Sophie. "We're partners now in making this place better for everyone." Sophie's eyes sparkled with possibility as they began to discuss the changes they would implement together, the policies they would develop, and the culture they would create. It was a conversation between two people who understood what it meant to be overlooked and undervalued, who had found strength in each other's courage, and who were determined to ensure that no other child would have to face the kind of isolation and cruelty that had brought them together. As they talked, other students began to gather around them, drawn by the energy and hope in their conversation. These were the quiet ones, the different ones, the students who had learned to make themselves small to avoid becoming targets. But now they sensed that something had changed, that the invisible woman who had spoken up for one of their own had somehow gained the power to speak up for all of them. Maria looked around at the growing circle of young faces, each one carrying stories of struggle and resilience that deserved to be honored rather than hidden. She thought about the journey that had brought her from Guatemala to this moment, through an abusive marriage and years of invisibility to a position where she could make a real difference in the lives of children who needed advocates and protectors. The transformation wasn't just hers. It belonged to every student who had ever felt alone, every child who had been told that their differences made them wrong, every young person who had learned to hide their light rather than risk having it extinguished by those who preferred darkness. As the bell rang and students began to disperse to their classes, Sophie lingered for a moment longer. "Maria," she said quietly, "what you whispered to Madison and her friends that day in the library, about choosing kindness or cruelty. I think they heard you. Madison actually apologized to me yesterday." The news was surprising but encouraging, a sign that even the most entrenched patterns of behavior could change when faced with genuine consequences and consistent expectations. "People can change," Maria replied, "when they're given reasons to change and support for changing. And when someone believes they're worth the effort to change," Sophie added with wisdom beyond her years. As Sophie walked away to join her classmates, Maria remained in the library for a few more minutes, surrounded by the books and silence that had witnessed both her lowest and highest moments at Hamilton Academy. She thought about the girl she had been when she first arrived in America, full of dreams but uncertain of her worth. She thought about the woman she had become during her marriage, diminished and afraid, but never entirely broken. She thought about the invisible cleaner who had spent 3 years watching and learning while staying safely in the shadows. And she thought about the person she was becoming now, someone who had found the courage to step into the light, not just for herself, but for others who needed protection and advocacy. The journey from invisible to essential, from powerless to purposeful, had been long and difficult. But every step had prepared her for this moment when her voice would finally be heard and her choices would finally matter. The Hamilton Academy that Maria Santos would help create would be different from the one she had known as a cleaning woman. It would be a place where intelligence was celebrated rather than feared, where vulnerability was supported rather than exploited, where consequences were consistent regardless of family wealth or influence. But most importantly, it would be a place where no child would ever have to cry alone in a library while others watched their pain and did nothing to help. Because sometimes the people we overlook are exactly the ones we need most, and sometimes the whispered truths of invisible women can change the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.